Republican primary when I was running for Senate. This time the kids, they're 2, they're 4, they're 7, and they can kind of come with us, and they're part of the journey a little bit. And so that's just like it's a really cool thing to see the country from the perspective of a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. Yeah. And it's just been a very, very nice thing. It's been a great family adventure for all of us.
So I really liked this story. We were together on the Tucker tour, that you were talking about how you may have had to cancel on Tucker because
Lord.
You got sick. That's a
you
real
didn't have any carnivals before you came here, right?
No, not today. No, that was a tough day. So that was in Hershey, PA, and we're not too far from Hershey, right?
No.
So yeah, I again, because you're surrounded by Secret Service and everybody knows who I am now, and so whenever I do something, there are like 10 separate iPhone cameras that are trained on me, right? And my kid, my 7-year-old, I'm like, all right, I really want you to go on a roller coaster with me at Hershey Park, and he goes, okay, but you have to go on one of these ridiculous spinny rides afterwards. And I do the roller coaster, it's great, and then we get on the spinny ride, and I just, about 2 seconds in, I think to myself, I'm going to throw up all over myself. And it was like going so fast that, and I could see these iPhone cameras from people in the, outside of the ride. I'm thinking to myself, this is going to look, when I throw up, it's gonna look like one of these old sprinklers, chook, 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 chook. And it's gonna be captured on camera for the entire internet to see. And luckily I held it together. I think the Secret Service may have actually stopped the ride a few seconds early because they could see that I was really not doing well. But whatever revenge my son, had he ever wanted to get revenge on me, he got it, that 2-minute spinny ride. But look, but it goes to show, that was a very miserable 2-minute spin ride. But my son, where else do you get to go to all these different theme parks and see all these different parts of the country? And it's just a very, very cool thing.
What a great opportunity to have your children with you.
It really is. And again, you see it through their eyes, and they make little observations, right? Or like, we're in Traverse City, Michigan, and they're really into the cherries that we bring home from Traverse City, Michigan. Or we go to Hershey Park, and they're really into, like they have all these Reese-themed treats at Hershey. It's just the kids notice stuff that I think you don't notice if you're just a 40-year-old guy.
Right.
And I think that noticing has been a really fun part of this.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Well, and your wife must be just, wow. She's super mama. How is she handling it?
She really is. My wife is just this amazing person, and she quit her job when Trump asked me to become his running mate. But she's a very brilliant and very accomplished corporate litigator, and she's like, look, if we're going to do this, then I'm going to make this as easy on the kids as possible, and I'm going to come around and travel with you as much as possible, right? Like, if we're going to do this, let's make it a family adventure. I will tell you a story. One of the first times that the president actually met my wife, the first times they had really talked in any great detail, we were actually throwing a fundraiser for him, and the president sort of greets Usha and gives her a big hug. Oh, you're so beautiful. I'm so glad to see you. And he's, those of us who know him know he's a very engaging guy, despite what the media tells you about him. He's actually just a very warm and normal person. And he asks her what she thinks about me being involved in politics. And she gives, if anybody knows my wife, it's like the perfect Usha answer. It's a very diplomatic answer. And she's like, well, sir, my husband really loves public service. We love the state of Ohio. And I'm just really thrilled to be able to help him out where I can. And Trump looks at her and goes, yeah, my wife hates it too.
I'm so glad you brought up President.
Honesty.
That's what I love about Trump. Like, Trump finds the real truth in something, and whether you want him to say it or not, he just points his finger right at it.
So I'm glad you brought him up, because a lot of people have brought up the fact that you are not a big fan of President Trump.
Sure.
And that you are very vocal about it. So, the big thing I think that moms would like to know is, what changed?
Yeah, well, a lot changed. One, I become a father, right? So my first was born in 2017, and then our second a couple years later, our third a couple years after that. And I think you think about the country a little bit differently, I think, at least I did when I became a father. I took a slightly different perspective, maybe a little bit more protective, a little bit more worried about the future than I had been. Even though life was going very well for us, I just think that,
Sure.
Becoming a dad changes your perspective like that. But I think really importantly is, there were a lot of predictions that were made about Donald Trump's 4 years in office. And I think for swing voters, people who are on the fence, there are a lot of predictions right now being made about Donald Trump. If he gets in office, all of these bad things will happen, right? That's what the media says. That's what the Democrats say. And a part of me, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's more important to be honest, I think, is I kind of bought into some of the lies in 2016. Well, and then he was president, and take-home pay was going up faster than it had in 40 years. Inflation was low. The border was secure. And remember, they all said Donald Trump was going to start World War III, and yet we had more peace around the globe than we had in a generation in this country. And you sort of like, okay. And I really, politics is sort of, I think the incentives are all messed up in politics because, people don't want to admit that they changed their mind. They don't want to admit that they're wrong. And so there's this thing where you try to pretend, even though it's obvious that you screwed something up, you never want to admit it. I think it'd be much better if we had political leaders say, you know what, I thought this was going to happen. Something else actually happened. I was wrong. Like, it's okay to be humble and say I screwed something up. And I again, for a lot of voters who are still on the fence, I'd say the very same thing they're saying about Trump now, they said in 2015 and 2016.
That's right.
And I actually think that we're going to have an even bigger and even better presidential term because we've got, frankly, so many more big problems to solve now than we did even in 2016. So look, basically, he did a hell of a job, and it's important to say I was wrong.
Yeah, I think I do too.
Right.
I want to be able to get to our moms. They have a lot of questions, and every one of their questions relates to this personal experience that they had. So, Debbie, if you want to get us started on that.
So, Senator, they all shared very moving stories that have personally affected them, and now they have a question for you regarding that.
And I wish I could have seen them. I'm sorry I'm a little late here, but it's the nature of a presidential campaign. You don't always control your schedule perfectly, but thank you.
Yes. Okay. So the first one I have here is we have Donica Hudson. She is from North Carolina, so she has a question for you.
Okay, Senator Vance. My family and I were trapped for 5 days living the nightmare of Hurricane Helene.
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate it. FEMA was nowhere to be found the first week and has done almost nothing. So my question is, what will the Trump-Vance administration do to restructure FEMA and to rebuild Western North Carolina?
Yes, ma'am. First of all, I'm sorry that it happened, and I'm sorry, most importantly, that your government didn't do its job in response to it. Because what part of, I guess you're from the western part of North Carolina?
Vanderbilt.
So one of the things that if you grew up in the Appalachian part of our country, whether in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, anywhere else, is you often feel like your government doesn't care about you. And unfortunately, after the hurricane, I think that region of the world was really neglected and really left behind by the people who should have done the most to look out for these innocent victims. And I hate to say it, but I actually think that there would have been less loss of life if the government had responded more quickly. And what do we need to do to restructure FEMA? I actually think this one is pretty straightforward. You've just got to fire the present leadership and tell FEMA to focus on American citizens and not the illegal migrant issue. But I think there's a second part of this, and it goes to the rebuilding effort. And first of all, I promise, I look you in the eye and I promise you that if we win, and I think we're going to win, by the way, I think we're going to win in Pennsylvania, we're going to win the whole country. But I promise you, I'll never forget where I came from, and I'll never forget that we have a responsibility to help you all rebuild. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about your story, though I understand I'm not going to get the full picture up here. But the other thing is, when you have a crisis like this, there are some things that FEMA is just not equipped for. And so I criticize FEMA for focusing too much on the illegal immigrant problem, not enough on American citizens. But let's be honest, this was really a Biden and Kamala Harris shortcoming when as soon as the rivers started to swell like they did, the 82nd Airborne should have been in Western North Carolina the next minute. That is what really screwed up. And if you think about all the bureaucracy of the federal government, right, you've got 8 different agencies that are supposed to do 8 different things. You need somebody who is in control, whose only job is to save as many lives as possible. And the fact that it took us 6-7 days before that was really possible, or that was happening in North Carolina, I hate to say it, I think that there was a lot of loss of life that wouldn't have otherwise happened, and just a lot of human suffering that we've got to do a better job of preventing next time.
Right.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Madeline Brame. She is from New York, and she has a specific question for you regarding her son.
Hello,
Yes, ma'am.
Vice President JD Vance.
Knock on wood.
She's claiming it.
You actually heard my story at the RNC. I spoke about my son.
Of course.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
What I want to know, what my question is what will a Trump-Vance administration do to strengthen and protect the rights for families of homicide victims legislatively?
Yes, ma'am. Well, first of all, again, I'm sorry that your government failed you, and I promise you that when we're in office, we're going to try to make sure that your government doesn't fail the next person who's dealing with what you're dealing with. And here's the basic issue. The progressives, and I don't think this is true of most Democrats, by the way, but the leadership of the Democratic Party has gotten in their mind that law enforcement is inherently racist. And I think that's a real disgrace. It's led us to, frankly, dismiss a lot of good cops, and it's meant that we don't empower people to go after the truly bad guys. And what I find so crazy about all this is, if you look at the statistics, ma'am, it is a very, very small number of people who commit the gross majority of the violent crime in our communities, right? This is not the gross majority of our citizens, whether they're white, black, or whatever, are law-abiding people. There is a very narrow slice of our country that commits chronic violent crime. And the thing that we have to do is change the laws, but most importantly, empower law enforcement to go after the bad guys, lock them up, so they're not hurting more kids like yours. That is fundamentally what you have to do. And what I think is so, I just can't believe that one half of our political leadership has gotten in their head that if you lock up criminals, that's somehow a bad thing. Locking up violent criminals is one of the core functions of government, right? And you don't have to lock that many people up. Just lock up the violent criminals, and we could do so much better. And part of this is legislative too. And I've sponsored legislation to this effect. Is we're getting to a point where we've got a major law enforcement crisis in our country. We've got a lot of great police officers that aren't re-upping. You've got a lot of great young men and women who don't want to become police officers because they think it's too hard of a job. We are going to have to really fix the pay and benefits for our local law enforcement so that they get the pay they deserve, but most importantly, so that we get the right people serving as police officers. Because if you think it's bad now, and unfortunately the crime rates are not in a good place right now, it's going to be a lot worse in 5 years if we don't get better people coming into law enforcement, because you've got a lot of very good people who are getting out of law enforcement right now.
Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
So we have an online question. This one is from Gabriella Mason from California. Families are struggling to pay their bills, afford groceries, let alone save for their future. In the last 4 years, food prices have risen nearly 26%. When is my dollar going to be a dollar again, and how fast can we get back to a 2019 normalcy?
There you go. You got to help us out here.
Well, the best thing we can do to lower prices is to elect Donald J. Trump President of the United States. That is the first and most important thing we got to do. And then I'll talk a little bit about what comes after. But I got to tell you this story. So we were actually in Reading, Pennsylvania for this. We were at a small Latino grocery store. The owners had just bought that grocery store a couple years prior, and my boys were with me, my 7-year-old boy and my 4-year-old boy, and they just wanted to come with Daddy on the campaign trail, and we were having a good time out there. And I'm standing, it illustrates how different kids are, because I tell the two of them, you can get anything you want, and the 4-year-old is trying to get like a gallon of ice cream, right? He's like me, and the 7-year-old, who's like his mama, is trying to get me to buy like a dozen or 2 dozen eggs. And I'm like, son, I meant like a candy, like go buy some chocolate. And he's like, no, Dad, you made the last 3 eggs this morning. If you don't get more eggs, Mommy's going to be really mad. It's like, okay, buddy, thanks for looking out. Very practical. But there were, of course, cameras falling around, because there always are. And so I grabbed some eggs, and I pointed out that eggs have gotten way more expensive under Kamala Harris's leadership. And in fact, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, eggs are about $3.20 a dozen from $1.50 a dozen. That's a huge price increase in just 3.5 years. And I unfortunately fear it's going to get worse if we promote her to president. But I was kind of joking with my kids. I said, yeah, this is really important to my family, because my kids, these guys eat about 14 eggs a day. obviously exaggerating, right? Making a joke about my kids who do eat who do eat a lot. So I had some journalist fact check me and say, there's no way that a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old could eat 14 eggs a day. And I'm like, it would be like me saying, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. And then the journalist being like, JD, in fact, ate a normal man-sized meal, not a horse, right? And you realize the media sometimes in this country is so obsessed with misleading us that they don't actually report, some of these real stories of people who are suffering. But I think the most important thing, to answer the questioner's question, is a lot of us don't fully appreciate how energy prices go into everything else. And so think about it. If you're, a construction worker and you're building a house, but the truck driver who's delivering the lumber to the job site is paying 50% more for diesel, then that house is getting more expensive, right?
Yeah.
And if you're a grocery store and the truck driver who delivers the groceries or the farmers who are producing the food are paying 50% more for energy, then that's going to make all our groceries go up. So the most important thing that we can do, Donald Trump always says this, drill, baby, drill. Lower the costs of energy, and that's the most important thing that we can do to lower the cost of food. And then the second thing to make life more affordable is, look, the government has got to stop spending trillions upon trillions of dollars that it doesn't have. When you do that, you increase the price of everything. Because think about it, when you're printing all this money to cover the government's debts, then all the dollars that are in our pockets become more and more worthless over time. And so, I hate to say it, Kamala Harris cast the deciding vote in trillions of dollars of new spending. We got to get her out of there and put somebody with common economic sense back in the White House.
And you see this all the time when you're in the grocery store.
Parents. We want parents making these decisions, not anybody else.
Yes.
And I find with each of you, I want to know so much more about your stories than I know, and so much more than we have time for, of course. But I just think to take something that is so profound away from our moms and dads is such a violation of every right that exists. So the reason why we establish government is to protect our rights, not to destroy our rights. And it's such a big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in this race. And ma'am, you mentioned education policy. I want to get into that. But let's be honest about something. One of the reasons why we have this incredible pressure. Look, being a 14-year-old kid, being a 12-year-old kid, we know it's hard, right? Kids have all kinds of tough things going on when they're teenagers, when they're pre-teenagers. And I think, unfortunately, in the era of social media, sometimes we take normal adolescent insecurities and we tell, especially our young girls, well, that's not an insecurity, that's because something's wrong with you. And remember, we used to live in a country that recognized, no, there's nothing wrong with you. We just have to teach people how to be comfortable with themselves and to be comfortable with who they are. And the fact that we've gotten away from that, I think, is really profound, and it's very damaging. But we ask ourselves, why have we gotten away from it? And I think we have to ask ourselves, who's getting rich from what we're pushing down the throats of parents and children? And the answer is, there is $1 billion industry in cross-sex hormones, in gender transition, and I think that we have to go the heart of the money and stop telling these pharmaceutical companies that they can make money by experimenting off of our children. It has to stop, and it will stop when Donald Trump is president.
You actually answered the next question we were going to do online, so we won't.
So profoundly unfair to people who have done the right way, who have waited in line, who have paid the fees, and this is one of the reasons why we have to get our hands wrapped around this illegal immigration problem. It's unfair because there are great people who want to come to our country, and I think to me the question that we have to ask is, what is it that we want out of welcoming newcomers into our country? We want people with great values. We want people who are willing to work hard, who are willing to play by the rules, who are going to contribute to their communities. And obviously you can't let everybody in that wants to come, but you've got to have an orderly process. And I think that part of what we've seen is we've redirected so many resources away from processing legal immigrants who are doing it the right way to focus on illegal immigration that's been facilitated by Kamala Harris, that it's probably harder to come in legally now than it was even 15 or 20 years ago. So we ought to devote the resources that are for processing legal immigrants to legal immigrants and not to this completely broken system that we have under Kamala Harris. So it's border security first, make sure we secure that southern border, and then I think we actually free up a lot of resources to focus on the legal immigration issue in our country. Thank you. I'll say a prayer for him tonight.
Thank you.
And not nearly in the way that you do, but we've of course experienced the problems of addiction in my own family. And one of the ways that I think about this is we want people to have second chances, because when you're caught in the throes of addiction, it's so hard to get out of it, but a lot of people do get out of it. But if they get out of it and then they relapse, and they relapse into fentanyl, sometimes there's not another second chance. And that's really what we have to change. That's why this poison is so dangerous and so deadly, is it takes away those second chances from our families, from our moms, from our dads, from our kids. It's got to stop. And it's disgraceful that we frankly have a government right now that's facilitating it instead of stopping it. And you talked about cutting through the red tape and what we can do on prevention and education. I think one of these things is, you can only do so much with so many dollars. And so let's say you have curriculum money that's going into radical gender ideas instead of teaching kids how to say no to drugs, how to resist peer pressure, the warning signs for addiction. Because look, you probably appreciate this, ma'am, having seen it, but some people get addicted the minute they take an opioid. And some people could take Percocet for 3 years and never get addicted. I've seen this even with my own friends who had a minor surgery, who take one Percocet and I'm never taking it again because I liked it way too much. It did something to me. We got to teach kids to recognize, right, when they're going down that very dark pathway. The second thing is, and I know friends from back home, family from back home, who were involved in detox. And if you think about recovery as being a very long road, the very first step is very often detox. And there are not enough detox facilities in the United States of America right now. We should empower our churches and our local community organizations to provide those detoxes, because you can't get into recovery if you don't do the detox first, and it's very, very hard to take that first step. So why don't we make it easier to take that first step in the first place, shut down the poison coming into our country in the first place, and teach our children the red flags and the warning signs about addiction. I think if we do that, we'll start getting down the road of solving this. Look, it is an unspeakable human tragedy what's going on in this country. 100,000 people, many of them in the prime of their lives. I've known so many people who have lost their lives to this, and I'm sure, ma'am, you're asking yourself the same questions, like, who would you have fallen in love with, right? What do kids have looked like? The human tragedy that we're allowing to happen in this country, it has got to stop. President Trump and I will fight to stop it, I promise you. For your views, I think it was smart to let individual nurses and moms and dads make these decisions, not try to force a one-size-fits-all approach from the federal government. And ma'am, unfortunately, the answer to your question is, if you've got 25 million, 20 million, whatever the number is of illegal aliens in your country, we're a compassionate people. We're not going to let people just expire on the streets, nor should we. So the compassionate thing for our own citizens, but I also believe for illegal aliens too, is to stop the open border and stop people coming into this country in the first place. There's no way to solve the problem without re-implementing some strong border policies. And if you look in the state of Pennsylvania, I believe the last time that I checked, but I'm sure the media fact checkers will double check my information here, but the average hospital emergency room wait time in the state of Pennsylvania is around 3 hours. Right, so you go to the emergency room and you're not getting the care that you need because we diverted so many resources from caring for people who ought to be here to focus on people who have no right to be here. We have to recognize that there are sometimes trade-offs, and the compassionate thing is not to open your border and allow Mexican drug cartels to sex traffic little kids into our communities. The compassionate thing for our own citizens, and I think for everybody else, is to secure the border and focus on some basic common sense law enforcement. That's what we have to do. Thank you. I don't know the backgrounds of a lot of folks in the room, but I'm 40 years old, and so I'm very much a child of the 90s. And my wife is 38, though she's probably going to get pissed off for saying that publicly. Can't take it back now. But, so her parents are legal immigrants from South India. Okay, and she was born and raised in San Diego, but I think because we grew up in the 90s, and I'm not saying things were perfect, don't mistake me, but we grew up in a country where we were taught to think about people as people and not as whatever artificial, superficial skin color they had. And I think because both of us grew up with that attitude, we met, we fell in love, we started a family, and we never thought anything of it. Right? I mean, there was never, the only funny and slightly awkward comment that anybody ever made is when my mom asked, what ethnicity Usha was, and I said she was Indian. She said, "Which tribe?" I said, "Well, slightly off, Mom, slightly off." But like she actually, my mom made this point to me, and I think it's, Mom is so smart. She's just one of the smartest people I've ever met. And she said, I get really mad at all these people talking about your biracial children and, whether they're white or whether they're Indian or what their background is. She's like, they're just our babies. Right? And I want us to think about all of our kids, whatever the color of their skin, they're just our babies. They're American babies, and that is what matters. And so I think one thing that we have to do is do better as leaders. Talking about, yes, of course, we've got, differences, and yes, of course, there are things that happen in America's history that aren't perfect. I'm not saying we ignore that, but we talk about it as a way to getting to a point where we see each other as Americans first and foremost. That's the most important thing. That's what we have to get back to. And then we also have to be honest, and this goes back to one of the earlier questions, that a lot of this crap is not something that anybody, black, white, Latino, anything, would teach their kids. They're learning it from very radical curriculums that are being planted in our schools by money coming from American taxpayers. And so I think the first thing that we have to do is defund CRT and all of the radical curricula that's going into our schools. That's really important. Makes their voice heard. The media is never going to be honest. The Democrats are never going to be honest. But if you want to take your country back, if you want to teach your kids your own values, if you want to save your children from unsafe neighborhoods, if you don't want your kids taught racial hatred disguised as diversity, then we have to get out there and we have to elect Donald Trump. And there's a lot that we can do to make that happen just in 20 days. Do you have friends or family that you think would probably vote the right way, but they haven't gone to the polls yet? Maybe they have an absentee ballot they haven't mailed in yet. Maybe you just want to post on social media like, hey, I saw JD Vance and he's not nearly as bad as the media says that he is, right? There are all of these ways where you can get involved, and think about the small number of ballots in 2020 that, if changed, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And a lot of the problems we've seen in the last 3.5 years simply are not happening in this country. So ask yourself, wake up on November the 6th. You want to be able to say, I did everything. And I think that the question over the next 20 days is, what does that everything mean? I think it's talking to your friends, talking to your family.